please.
Thank you, Zillard, for the introduction. Without wanting to sound too emotional, but actually I'm really happy to be here. Believe it or not, I've been waiting for just 10 years to make a talk like this, what I'm going to do today. So I will try to give my best here and to stay within the time limits to get all the points across that I want you to think about. So model-based testing demystified, if you look at the title, I don't know how much of you still have the luxury to watch TV. There's like this series called Mythbusters, where there's these two crazy Americans blowing up stuff and trying to find, is there really a truth behind a saying? I want to argue that in Germany, we have been already much earlier having such a series for little kids, where there was, for example, this test, like we have this saying in Germany, when it's cold outside, you should wear a hat. Right? Because 80% of your warmth goes through the head, right? And what did they do? They put like a guy naked in a cold chamber with a hat on, check, is the guy freezing, right? And they busted that myth. So coming now back to this presentation, okay, this is the way it works. So model-based testing, most likely every single one of you has at least heard about it in some context or another. I have to say that my father has told me that before I was born, he had people at his workplace coming to him and saying, you know, there's this new thing called model-based testing, and you know, let's get it deployed. So I don't want to really talk about much about that right now. I will kind of sprinkle some information about model-based testing in general into the presentation. Still, I don't assume that any of you have really any knowledge about model-based testing as such. What I want to attack here is a couple of myths that I've been constantly encountering in my career. I've only time for 4 here, so let's take them one at a time. So the first thing is like, you know, 2 people meet in the floor, Gabor and Laszlo maybe, and you know, what are you doing? The other guy says, well, I'm actually using MBT, and the other guy, oh wow, okay, great. You know, but the question is, do we really know what the guy is doing, even if that's not just MBT, but model-based testing? I've had the real-world situation in a major German bank that we came there to do this great presentation about how great model-based testing is. We wanted to show a first slide, and the guy says, no slides. Tell me, what is your model? I go, what do you mean, what's your model? Well, I want to understand what you define to be a model. I have 10 people coming to me telling me all something different, and they're all calling it model-based testing. How can that be? So if you just think about a few questions here that you see, this is questions that I can straight away ask, right? Okay, what are you actually modeling? How are you modeling it? Are you modeling your tests? Are you modeling the system that you're supposed to be testing? And then there's these interesting questions. When you do model-based testing, do you actually do model-based testing by generating tests in your head? And this is a funny question, funny thing, right? This is today a topic even in the certification discussion. When can we start calling something model-based testing? And we will get back to this point in later points, because actually there's also a value proposition we need to fulfill, right? Of course, we can consider model-based testing anything where a model is used in a testing context, right? But over years now, it has been used in one way, and then it has been starting to get blurry. Okay. But of course, you know, maybe we should just ask the person that knows everything, you know, what is MBT? And of course, the findings are surprising. Basically, we're looking MBT being the shoe you just wanted to buy all the time. And I don't know, you cannot read most likely the details here, but there's just nothing about testing here, right? So that kind of shows you also this MBT letters are also used in very many different instances. Now, the sad fact that I'm trying to tell people for years is there is just not one definition of MBT, and I'm always asking people to take a step back and understand that it's really an umbrella of different approaches. And at least I have been over the years trying to classify them a bit. This is actually a bit ripped from a colleague of mine, Bruno Legard and Mark Utting, who wrote a book in 2006 about how kind of test specification has evolved, and there's this pyramid from there. But as we see here, it's not just model-based testing, it's also testing in general. But I mean, at the end of the day, you know, model-based testing is really a design technique, and it is really also something that surpasses real regular test execution automation. What I don't want to talk about too much here is that when we look at that pyramid here, each of these levels have different value propositions, right? I mean, they're good in certain things, they're bad in other things. What has been attempted over time is to kind of simplify that information and make some kind of a heat map. Okay, how do these approaches compare? Where are they good, where are they bad? And the point of this slide here is not to say that, you know, when I do manual testing, my test coverage, I have a good reason why that's a 2. It could be a 1, it could be a 3, right? But I mean, these are, of course, subjective numbers here, but they just try to give a feel for how things actually compare. Again, I don't want to talk about this here so much, but I just want you to understand that all the different approaches carry different value propositions, and that's one challenge in the MBT community to kind of put that all together, right? What is the actual value when I'm using model-based testing? Okay. Okay, let's get to the second myth. Now, this one is a favorite of mine. I mean, quite often also in sales, you encounter these guys who call model-based testing, right? I mean, all you do is you click the button, you go, and that's it. You get tests, you're done, right? I mean, all people, wow, you're the test manager. Wow, you know, I don't need people anymore, right? I just need to click that button, and boom, there's the test, right? And the tests are going like, oh my God, when we start using this tool, they're gonna all fire us, right? Because they don't need us anymore. Everything done by the tool. It is, luckily, not so simple. So let's first get some things straight. Before you push that button, you must stick some things into such tools to get tests, right? So number one, that's a model, right? And the model, again, depends on the approach. Let's fix it from our point of view, a model of the system that you actually, or of the functionality, the system operation that you want to test. Secondly, often overlooked, right? There's also test generation metrics you need to provide. Actually, when you look at it, in theory, no matter if you use MBT or not, testing is an infinite problem. There's many ways how you could test a system. Just because you use a tool that's not changing. And the trick how the model-based testing tools do it, they tell you, okay, tell me what kinds of tests are you interested in? And this is by setting test targets. And what then falls out is basically the test logic containing test data and timing as well. Now the second thing is, right, in the beginning, people are very excited. I can get thousands of tests, right? Yeah, I could not write that manually. Yeah, but there's only one slight problem, right? I mean, okay, we have a test, but what means that this test is actually correct? Actually, the bad news in a way is we still have to validate every test. And why is that? Because the test is just as good as the model. And who has written the model? Well, the guy who has been doing the testing. Let's put it like this, right? So we can still have, let's call it different understanding than development or even the customer from the system. I generate 10,000 tests. I start executing them. First one fail, second one fail, third one fail. And then you go like, okay, I just got 997 to go, right? So the thing is, the mass of tests is really not a measure for model-based testing. Actually, the trick is how to provide little test sets and that you understand how important the validation is. Just because the tool generated it, it still requires really a review and, you know, talking about it, etc. The one good point about this is we no longer need a system under test that's live. As testers, we have a technology that we can use without having development anything, right? I create a model which is almost like a virtual system, right, that I want to be testing. And then I get tests, and that gives me a lot of flexibility as a tester. Okay, and then another thing, and here I'm glad that Jeff mentioned a lot about shift left, right, is that we also need to understand that MBT is not a one solution that fits everything, right? We need a complete solution in order to tickle the most out of this technology. So MBT is a technology that addresses mainly test design. So when you get an MBT tool, that does not mean you can just click the next button to execute the test against your system XYZ. You still need for test automation everything that you required before for test automation, basically a harness that enables you to connect to the SUT or whatever else we have in UI automation available, right? That's not part of your model, right? Your model is just the logic, right? And the next step is then the test execution. And the trick here is, of course, the bottom picture shows a bit these phases, right? And that goes all back to the previous talk about shifting left, right? MBT is a technology that allows you to get results much earlier. Again, you don't need a system under test. And the trick here is, of course, the more of these boxes here you start automating, right? So if you combine MBT with automated test execution, of course, these effects ripple through and give even better results. Okay, and then my favorite myth here that I could just base the whole talk on is this thing that is a stab to the heart. So I have to out myself here as a tester, right, by any means. And it's not been always easy in MBT as a tester, because a lot of the tools and the people behind the tools come actually from theoretical computer science and software development backgrounds. And sometimes you just wonder about that a little bit. I mean, my first job, the first time when I got into MBT, I was not working for Conformic. At the time, my boss came to me and said, MBT looks really good. I mean, can generate test automatically, but what about the models, right? Testers cannot model, right? I mean, come on, testers cannot model. Where do we get the models from? I mean, otherwise, we cannot do anything with it. So that already made me think, well, I'm a tester. I'm supposed to run this project, right? I mean, kind of strange. But OK, this was 10 years ago. Look at the date. The next thing, I don't know how many of you know Darkstuhl. It's like this high-profile yearly event where different topics are discussed by all the experts from the world. And one of them was MBT. And in there, we had one of these experts, an academic, basically being maybe not literally like this, but of course pushing the point here a little bit, saying, well, you know, MBT, I mean, what's the difference between generating assembly and generating tests? It's all the same thing. I'm generating something, you execute it, it's done, right? No more work to be done. And then, of course, the last one is a sign of a resignation. This was a gray-haired gentleman in a German testing event who was telling me, son, you know, I mean, we've been around for many years, more than you, and we have tried to do to tell testers how to model, and it has just never worked. Forget about it, right? So I think that guy tipped me over, and at that point I said, you know, screw it. I'm going to now really try to do this right. So for those people that can read, MBT means model-based testing. And there's a T that means testing, right? So you would assume that that technology is for testing. So what happened that a lot of the modeling notations, right? When I say modeling, what do most of you think? Most likely, oh, a diagram, graphical, everything. No, no, no. For many people years ago, this was you program. You use Java, you use Spec-C or something like that, right? Languages that in testing not necessarily anybody has ever been exposed to. And I kept on hearing arguments, well, you know, we have 1 million Java developers, but we have only, you know, 1,000 that know TDCN3. It's clear, you know, for example, that these technologies, I can get a Java guy anywhere, right? But the whole point is that there was also this theory we should have the developers write the models, right? I mean, that's, of course, great, but what are we losing then? The tester's viewpoint. And the thing is, for me, always also, there's a third component, the so-called customer, product owner, whatsoever. These basically, when we're doing modeling, it's not just good enough that I understand my model that I'm writing, but also I need to be able to share it to everybody around, right? So basically, in a nutshell, it's just down to the point that we're trying to say, when we're doing modeling for test generation, there is classic testing skills required. And the idea here is not that model-based testing replaces the work for a tester. It enables them to be more powerful. And usually in my courses that I give on model-based testing, I tell it to the people, okay, imagine you're the tester, you stand in the dark room and there's a fly and you need to find it, right? Instead of you starting throwing rocks around, we give you a flamethrower and we let you explore the room, right? I mean, it's not to say that with that flamethrower you will hit that bug, but at least you have a much better chance, right? I mean, it's a luxury that many testers don't have today, that you can have just your test sets being very flexible and updated very fastly all the time. So I will skip this. Just because I'm running out of time, I have to just go into the final point. There's also this thing is like, okay, I have this toolbox, and then I have my testing expert look at MBT, and the guy says, wow, this is really cool. We should just use it, right? What we should understand, as in the other presentations on testing as a service, whatever we had before, as well on the assassins, it is a disruptive change, and it's not just a cool technology. If you start with this attitude, here's a cool new tool which does cool new stuff, that's not going to get you very far. These gains that you can get from model-based testing deployments come from changing the way of working, and as we have just learned, change is painful, change, you know, is for people. It was even argued some people cannot change, it's very worrisome. But also I want to point out that the change does not only affect the testers, but it also affects the test management, right? So as a tester, I no longer focus on individual tests, but I look at the overall functionality. That sounds quite straightforward, but please practice it to understand that it is just different, right? And another thing is the infamous topic about number of tests, right? Can I just kind of close the thing here? Oh, yes, so the number of tests basically is a measure that is very classic in testing. Unfortunately, it's not as such very meaningful. When we talk about model-based testing, we usually talk about coverage. Okay, these slides are available. I'm sorry that I did not manage to keep everything here within the time, but there's, I think, some good things in here. Maybe one thing just quickly to mention, in your planning, if you're interested in model-based testing, it's also about acquiring competence, and as has been stated in the introduction, IS2QB is working on a foundation-level module for model-based testing. I just encourage everybody to take a look at that once that becomes public. And an industrial case study for further reference. So if I want you to walk away with something, I think you should just firstly understand model-based testing requires a second look. What is it that the people are trying to promote, that are trying to talk to you about model-based testing? Evaluate if that meets your needs, right? Secondly, understand that it's a disruptive process change. And finally, for me, model-based testing only works with testers, right? You should deploy this with testers and not change, the personnel in your testing processes. So, yes, thanks for the extra minute.
Thank you, Stephan. You owe us around 200 minutes altogether.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. So questions? Sure, Attila has some questions.
I wanted to ask about the maintenance of such a model. So a model can be really complex, and you can traverse a model through several paths, right?
Sure.
And and then you change something in the code, and then you have to find somewhere in between, on some of the paths, you have to find the place where to modify the model, right?
Sure.
Because you don't want to regenerate it, because if you generate the model, even the bug within the model, it may happen. How do you see them maintain? How do you maintain such a model, for example?
Yeah, so classically, we usually advise to maintain the models, right? And actually, to have as the key argument that instead of maintaining your test set, to maintain the model saves you aspects of maintaining that. There is, let's say, at least in theory, a chance that this may change your test generation. You're absolutely correct, but it depends also a lot on the way how you are doing your modeling. A lot of it, what I was not able to talk about was about, you have to define really working methods for how to define models. Complex models are good for nobody, right? So you have to analyze, for yourself, what do you encapsulate in the model? It's not the whole implementation. For example, if we use about system, when you go about system testing, quite often we say, you model actually use cases in your model, right? So you take the scope of a use case and create a model for every different use case in order to contain also the complexity. Because if we have a big IT system with lots of nodes in there, that already, a single use case can really create a lot of model diagram information. So the trick here is really also to address this by the modeling technique. So, yes.
Any other question? Sure.
Thanks. Hi. So if I understand correctly, you suggested that the testers themselves create these models that will serve as a basis for model-based testing later on. But normally in a project which is model-oriented or uses models to an extent at least, there's also another model created by analysts and designers of the project.
Sure.
How do these two models relate to each other? Can they use up each other's work somehow?
Yeah, so this is a classic question, and that's one of the points where I have also very strong opinions on. So I suggest that these models are maybe inspiring each other, but they're not directly related. So I discourage the use of design models for testing. The thing what I've learned over the past years is that just as for test scripting language. Also for modeling for testing, there's certain concepts that are really relevant for modeling for testing, but they're not relevant for any of the other phases, right? And I have personally over time deviated away from like, let's find one modeling notation that solves everybody's problems instead of giving somebody a very focused solution. You do testing, you do modeling, let's put that together. That has been a very successful recipe. On the other hand, it so to say breaks a bit the cycle, right? I mean, there's also otherwise this bottom up that people are starting to say, let's take the models that testers create as documentation for the higher level, right? But I mean, there's information in this model, especially a lot about data, right? I mean, when I generate tests, that means there's not just do an action, right? But it's also what you do in that action, what data you enter, what data you verify. That information usually that higher level never thinks about, or it's beyond them, right? But when we get to test execution, it's critical. So the modeling for testing has a delta of extra kind of methods that, or constructs that you need for modeling. So yes, in a nutshell, I would say, unfortunately, I mean, we're still looking into ways how we actually sync these things, but quite often the sad reality is that these diagrams coming from the higher level specifications are not maintained regularly, and they quite easily fall out of sync, and then you start having this problem, well, we have the realities change so much on us, right? I mean, it becomes very hard to keep them kind of aligned. Yes.
Any more questions? Of course, RP.
Thanks. Well, I was always wondering, in general, of course it depends on the situation, but in general, is it more difficult to get a hand on a test oracle than, on the whole, like for example, generating test scripts, using some model, it would take you some effort. Is it more difficult to generate expected outcomes, or is it usually also part of the model?
No, so again, it depends on your test MBT technology, right? There's many tools that avoid this problem and say the user defines a test oracle, right? But I would call them the higher end tools. They do compute it, and it's very complex. I mean, this is, in my first slide I mentioned about symbolic model checking and constraint solving. I mean, there's basically, on the surface, you would not probably believe what's underneath the hood, right? I mean, when you work with these tools and you model, what's going on underneath is really higher math. And let's say it also requires processing power to deal with these kind of, test generation. So I'm not saying this is easy to do, this kind of automatic test oracle generation, right? But I mean, there's multiple tools that can handle that, but it is really a new class of MBT tool, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephan.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation, and you can see the conforming booth during the lunch as well and ask Stephan.